In the late 8th century, a menace materialized on the horizon of Europe. Monastic chroniclers recorded terrifying portents. Fiery dragons streaking across the northern sky, and unearthly lights flashing in the darkness, seemingly to foreshadow an unprecedented calamity. And in 793, that calamity struck. Heathen raiders from Scandinavia descended without warning on the holy island of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria, miserably devastating God's church by looting and slaughter. The shock of this attack echoed through Christendom. A Northumbrian scholar at the time, Alcuin of York, captured the horror in a letter to the king. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert spattered with blood of the priests of God, given as prey to pagan peoples. The Viking Age had well and truly begun, ushering in nearly 3 centuries of intermittent warfare in which sea-born Scandinavian warriors, later romantically dubbed the Vikings, raided, plundered, and sometimes even conquered far-flung lands. What followed Lindisfarne was not an isolated atrocity, but the beginning of a vast saga of raiding that would touch almost every corner of Europe, from the British Isles and Frankish Francia to Muslim Iberia and even the distant rivers of Eastern Europe. Viking raiders became a byword for terror and ferocity. Yet beyond the blood and fire recorded by terrified monks, there lies a complex military and cultural phenomenon. How exactly were these raids conducted across the Viking Age? How did small bands of Nordic adventurers evolve into great armies capable of toppling entire kingdoms? What motivated them? Was it greed for gold, hunger for land, a thirst for glory, perhaps even a religious zeal? And how did their onslaught reshape the politics of Europe? A lot of questions, but don't worry, we've got a lot of answers. I think by the end of it, you'll understand what happened and why it happened. So how about you come with me? Because today, we go back to the Viking Age together. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. If it is your first time here, or if you are among the few who have not clicked the subscribe button yet, I invite you to do so. Also leave a like, a comment. It's all good for the algorithm. You'll also have 0 ads on this video, which is a very nice touch. I'm sure you can agree. It is due to the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who chose to donate, and those who checked out the merch store. Even out of curiosity, I do appreciate it. And you have my thanks, everyone supporting the channel. Now, without further ado, let's get down to the topic at hand. Nice and slow as usual. Get nice and relaxed. The first phase of Viking raiding, late 8th through the 9th century, was characterized by more hit-and-run assaults launched from the sea against vulnerable coastal targets. And there were plenty of vulnerable coastal targets. In these decades, Norse warbands were generally small and highly mobile, relying on surprise and speed as their greatest weapons. Their signature tool? The clinker-built longship, a sleek wooden vessel with a shallow draft, both sail and oar-powered, capable of remarkable speed and able to beach on any coast or glide far up a river estuary. These ships gave the Vikings strategic and tactical mobility unmatched by their contemporaries. They could peer out of the morning mist, land a force of warriors directly on the shore, and depart before local defenses could even have a chance to muster. Monasteries, isolated port towns, coastal villages, rich in provisions and treasure, but usually lacking garrisons. That was their favored prey. The weak, the defenseless. An early entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that when three strange ships arrived on the Dorset coast in 789, the local reeve, who rowed out to greet these presumed traders, was unceremoniously killed. Quite rude, and a grim harbinger of what was to come. In these initial raids, Viking tactics emphasized surprise, ferocity, and quick extraction. We mentioned that raid on Lindisfarne. Well, that exemplified this. The Norse longships landed without warning. The raiders fell upon the monastic community with sword and axe, and then vanished with slaves and holy treasures before any organized resistance could arrive. Contemporary accounts stress the utter shock of such attacks on places deemed inviolate. Alcuin, writing of Lindisfarne, marveled that, quote, ships could suddenly appear from over the horizon to wreak havoc in a land that had felt safe for centuries. The psychological impact of these early strikes was immense too. Christian writers interpreted them as divine punishment, or even worse, portents of apocalypse. Language of lamentation and wrath permeates all the reports. A chronicle entry for 793 speaks of, quote, immense flashes of lightning, fiery dragons, and a great famine, preceding the heathen onslaughts, and framing the Viking raids as a nearly supernatural catastrophe. Yet not all early raids went unopposed, and not all of them ended in a Viking victory. A lesser-known incident in 794, for example, saw a Viking band plundering the monastery of Jarrow, that is, Wearmouth in Northumbria, and they were met with disaster. The chronicle records that while the raiders sacked the site, local forces struck back. Several Viking leaders were slain as the Norse fled to their ships. A sudden storm shattered some of their vessels, drowned many of their warriors, and those who swam ashore were promptly cut down at the river's mouth. Now this account shows that early Vikings often gambled with fate. Sure, swift riches, they were possible, but reversal of weather or armed locals could turn a raid into a death trap. Indeed, the North Sea could be as deadly as any foe. If you don't know about that, go and look up some videos of the North Sea. It is not a gentle ride. Well, the same Northumbrian entry notes that, quote, some of their ships were shattered to pieces by the violence of the weather. Many of the crew were drowned. Viking raiders had to navigate not only enemy swords, but also the capricious elements on their long voyage home. And it indeed is a long way when you only have a wooden longboat going between England back to Scandinavia. So by the 830s and 40s, Viking raids were accelerating in frequency, and with that, they were growing bolder. No longer content with summer forays from Scandinavia, some Viking bands began to establish winter bases on islands or river mouths near their targets. The Annals of St. Bertin, a Frankish chronicle, record that in 843 a fleet of Northmen attacked Nantes in Brittany, killing the bishop and many clergy and laity, and then settled there for the winter, as if it was their new permanent dwelling place. Now this is interesting, because it is one of the first hints that Vikings were learning to stay and exploit a region, rather than just the old-fashioned hit and run. But it also suggests a growing logistical sophistication. You see, these raiders could provision themselves on foreign soil through plunder and extortion, allowing year-round operations. In 845, the Viking onslaught reached a new peak of audacity. A fleet estimated at 120 ships sailed up the Seine River and attacked Paris, the West Frankish royal capital. West Frankish King Charles the Bald mustered an army, but, finding victory doubtful, resorted to paying a hefty ransom of 7,000 livres of silver to buy off the invaders. This payoff, one of the earliest recorded Danegeld in Francia, shows a lesson that many would learn. Well-organized Viking forces could sometimes be satisfied with tribute in lieu of battle, and quite often it was a more pragmatic choice by kings who saw little hope of outright defeating the raiders in the field. It would become quite a trend. As the 9th century progressed, Viking warfare seems to have evolved quite dramatically. What had begun as seasonal raiding by small autonomous bands had transformed into full-scale invasions by large coalitions, often referred to by Anglo-Saxon and Frankish writers as great heathen armies. The most famous of these was, of course, the Great Heathen Army, not so much an umbrella term anymore, but rather a term for a specific large group. Now, this large group in particular was one that descended on England in 865. Thankfully, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives us a quite good clue of what was going on. According to the Chronicle, this Viking army, composed of warriors from Denmark and elsewhere in Scandinavia, landed in East Anglia in 865, and immediately secured horses, either by purchase or as tribute from local kings. The Chronicle and later sources note that King Edmund of East Anglia provided the invaders with horses in exchange for peace. Well, perhaps we could use provided. Perhaps he was robbed of them. Who knows? Terminologies. Mounted on local horses, the Vikings gained strategic mobility inland. By late 866, they seized the city of York in Northumbria, exploiting the internal dissension among the Northumbrian rivals. In subsequent years, this army roved across England with alarming effectiveness. Northumbria and East Anglia quickly fell under their control. East Anglia's King Edmund himself was captured and gruesomely martyred in 869, according to legend. Rest in pieces to Edmund. And even the Kingdom of Wessex was hard-pressed to survive their onslaught. The great army's commanders, figures like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Guthrum, traditionally identified as sons or kinsmen of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, by the way, coordinated multi-year campaigns of conquest, rather than just simple hit-and-run raids. But importantly, it has to be said that these Viking armies did not simply raid and depart. Those days were over. They wintered in enemy territories and established semi-permanent encampments known in Old English as long forts or winter quarters, a term used in Irish chronicles too. Archaeological discoveries at Repton in Mercia and Torksey on the River Trent, for instance, have revealed traces of sizable Viking camps with defensive earthworks and evidence of workshops, trading and feasting, effectively proto-towns that sustained armies during the cold months. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that Vikings wintering in York to 867 to 868, in Mercia at Nottingham 868 to 69, and later at sites like Thetford and London. That's right, that London. It's been around for quite some time. With these entrenched bases, Viking forces could refit ships, care for animals, and plan fresh offensives come spring. Better weather makes things easier. The logistical organization of the Viking great armies thus marks a step change from the earlier times. Supply lines were secured by extorting food and tribute from local populations, and the armies could split or regroup as needed. In 871, for example, a great summer army of reinforcements arrived from Scandinavia and joined the fray in Wessex, showing how Viking forces could be replenished from overseas. By the late 9th century, the British Isles were witnessing not mere raids, but a Scandinavian invasion and settlement. You know it's trouble when they bring their wife and kids with them. They're here to stay. Large swaths of eastern England became what was known as the Danelaw under Viking rule, while in Ireland, Viking warlords founded coastal kingdoms, such as Dublin itself, established as a Norse long fort in 841, still of course existing as quite the nice city today, albeit with a few changes in decoration. Continentals, too, they faced large-scale Viking incursions. Francia, fragmented by civil wars among Charlemagne's grandsons, proved to be quite the inviting prospect. Viking armies repeatedly sailed up the great rivers, the Seine, the Rhine, the Loire, to sack cities deep inland. Paris was again besieged in 885 by a massive Viking force. An eyewitness to that siege, the monk Abbo of Saint-Germain, described the Seine River literally choked with hundreds of Viking longships. We have the quote from his text as follows: 700 sailing ships, not counting the smaller barks. At one stretch, the Seine was lined with vessels for more than 2 leagues, so that one might ask in astonishment what cavern the river had been swallowed up. The defenders, led by Count Odo of Paris, endured months of onslaught, repelling assaults on the walls and a key bridge fortification despite desperate moments when siege engines and arrows shook their hastily built wooden tower to its foundations. Eventually, Emperor Charles the Fat arrived with an army, but instead of fighting, he infamously paid the Vikings off. And then it got worse, he even allowed them passage to raid Burgundy. Well, he basically did this because they were in rebellion against him at the time, basically making his problem somebody else's. It was all part of the deal. Incidents like this, they show how by the late 9th century, Viking forces had grown into formidable armies, capable of siege warfare, and even protracted campaigns. Their organization had adapted. They fielded units that could divide tasks between raiding outward and guarding a base camp. They negotiated diplomatically for advantage, or more likely for gold, and some leaders even adopted the titles king, or in their tongue konungur, in the lands they overran. Now if that doesn't show a solid political control, I don't know what does. It was in this period that we also saw Vikings turning from the pure barbaric raiders into long-term settlers. After decades of plundering the Frankish realms, one Viking chieftain, Hrolfr, Latinized as Rollo, accepted a grant of land in Normandy from King Charles the Simple in 911, essentially exchanging his transient raiding for the role of a Christian count, and later Duke of Normandy. A similar pattern occurred in the British Isles. The men of the great heathen army in Northumbria shared the land and farmed it in 876, according to the Chronicle, signifying permanent colonization. Now all these developments, you might think they could mean an end to the Viking reigns, settle down for a more peaceful life, but it was far from it. They were rather an evolution in strategy. Raiding could bleed into conquest, and state building when conditions were favorable. And for the moment, they were. So let's understand a bit more how the Viking raids were conducted. You got to appreciate the military technology to do this, along with the tactics. It all underpinned their success, catching everyone off guard. Different tactics, of course, to everybody else. A shock to the system of those established kingdoms. At the heart of Viking logistics was the iconic longship. You all know the ones. A technological marvel of the age. These vessels, typically built 15 to 30 meters in length, were constructed with overlapping planks. We call this in naval terminology clinker-built, which made them light and flexible on rough seas. A shallow keel allowed navigation in as little as 1 meter of water, meaning Vikings could beach their ships on any sandy strand or sail far upriver, deep into the hinterland. In Francia, for example, they navigated the Loire to sack Tours and Garonne to reach Toulouse. In England, they ascended the Thames and the Ouse. In the east, Swedish Vikings rowed down the Dnieper and Volga. The longship's combination of sail power for open ocean travel and oar power for maneuvering and speedy bursts gave the Vikings a technical edge. They could appear and disappear rapidly at whatever point of their choosing. No less important, by the way, these ships were double-ended, facilitating quick reversals of direction, and could be portaged over short land crossings. According to some sagas and later accounts, Vikings even dragged ships overland to bypass river obstructions, feats that of course astonished their adversaries and allowed attacks from unexpected directions. Viking raiding tactics emphasized mobility and shock. They typically landed at dawn or under the cover of early morning light, when communities were least prepared. Warriors disembarked carrying round shields, spears, axes, swords, often advancing in intimidating shield wall formations if they met with resistance. In open battle, Viking troops favored aggressive charges to break enemy lines, but they were also capable of feigned retreats and ambushes, stratagems learned from both experience and perhaps encounters with steppe nomads and others. However, pitched battles were not their first choice. Surprise and terror were preferred to risking heavy casualties. A small coastal settlement might be stormed outright, but a fortified town, that could be bypassed in favor of softer targets, unless of course the prize was worth a protracted fight. Think about the siege of Paris or London, not just for the treasure of it, but for the general prestige. The psychological aspects of Viking attacks cannot be overstated either. The raiders deliberately cultivated a reputation for ruthlessness and brutality to encourage defenders to flee or surrender. Frankish nobles describe how in 843 at Nantes, the Vikings slaughtered clergy and congregants alike during Mass. That's right in the middle of a church service, barbarically going there and just cutting throats. In Britain, monasteries like Jarrow, Iona, and Kells were hit repeatedly. The attackers often killed or enslaved the monastic community and made off with reliquaries, jeweled crosses, and liturgical plates, thus spreading tales of horror that in turn often led to panicked flight at the first sight of a sail. But what about organizationally? Well, in those terms, Viking forces in the early period had been loose bands led by a chieftain or a jarl, bound by personal loyalty and the prospect of shared loot. But over time, those structures somewhat professionalized. By the era of the Great Army, Viking hosts showed evidence of divided commands and coordinated strategies. They could, for instance, split into 2 or 3 contingents to cover more territory or trap opposing forces in a pincer maneuver. In 865 and 66, while one Viking division secured Northumbria, another negotiated in East Anglia, and yet another probed into Mercia. A multi-pronged approach. All comes down to logistics. But they also demonstrated the ability to build or utilize fortifications. The old Norse word borg, which means fort, appears in some contexts, and Saxon accounts speak of Vikings fortifying camps with ditches and ramparts. When King Alfred of Wessex countered the Vikings by building a chain of fortified burhs or towns in the 880s and 90s, the Vikings responded by avoiding these or attempting sieges, indicating a constant tactical interplay. And here's a remarkable account from the Chronicon of Abo, describing the 885 siege of Paris. It recounts how the Viking leader Sigfrid first parleyed, offering to spare the city for a price. A diplomatic tactic. Well, it didn't work. He was rebuffed. So he proceeded to deploy siege machines and battering rams in a protracted assault. Now that shows that Vikings were not just rabid berserkers. They were capable warriors, prepared to adapt and use any means. Negotiation, intimidation, even engineering. The most important thing was achieving that goal. Now, logistics we've discussed a little bit, but in a little bit more detail. Of course, they were equally as crucial. A large fleet required immense supplies, food, water, fodder for the horses after the 9th century, etc. So early on, Vikings solved this by living off the land. Plundering was both their mission and their supply chain. They would seize grain, livestock, stores from settlements. But as their ambitions grew, so did their logistical footprint. Overwintering forces needed reliable provisions. Hence, the Vikings often chose winter camps near fertile regions, or traded with locals when not openly in war. Silver and loot could purchase goods as well as loyalty. And moreover, they established semi-permanent markets at their bases. Archaeology tests that theory too. We find a lot of things from Viking camps in England, including weights, scales, imported hack silver, even some craft works. That indicates an active trade, even during active military campaigns. But then we have communication and intelligence. There were also factors at play. And while we admittedly have few records of Viking scouts or spies, it is evident that they possessed information about their targets, likely gleaned from earlier traders or even from local dissidents. The very fact that the first recorded raiders in England in 789 and 93 struck rich, poorly defended monasteries, it suggests that Vikings knew where wealth was concentrated and where defenses were weak. In some cases, maybe disgruntled locals could have tipped them off. Frankish chronicles even hint that Viking leaders were sometimes invited as mercenaries in Frankish civil wars, and that was when they learned the lay of the land in the process. Either way, the Vikings' extensive trade networks also doubled as intelligence networks, keeping them informed of political turmoil or lucrative opportunities abroad. Of course, loose lips sink ships, as we say. If you want to know more about medieval spies in general, I made a video about it, I think a couple weeks back. You might want to go check it out. Medieval playlist. Well, we can move now to one of the most astonishing aspects of the Viking Age, and that's the sheer geographic breadth of the Norse raiding activity. It really is something to behold, You see, over 3 centuries, Scandinavian adventurers carried their raven-bannered ships to the very distant shores, not only striking the well-known targets in the British Isles and Frankish Gaul, but Iberia, Italy, even North Africa, and of course, into Eastern Europe too. This wide range was facilitated by the Vikings' extraordinary seafaring skills, but also their opportunistic adaptability. So let's start with the British Isles. They endured some of the earliest and most persistent raids. After Lindisfarne, attacks multiplied along the coast of England, Ireland, and Scotland. The Hebrides, Orkneys, and Shetlands were frequented by Norse seafarers by the early 800s, often used as bases to launch raids on mainland Scotland and Ireland. The Annals of Ulster record that in 795, quote, the burning of Retru by the heathens took place, likely referring to Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland, marking Ireland's first Viking raid. And soon, Viking longships became a yearly menace to the Irish shores. Irish annals called the Vikings Gael. In their tongue just means foreigners, or just simply heathens. And by the 830s, they note fleets plundering deeper inland via river systems. In 837, perhaps 60 Viking ships sailed up the River Boyne, and another 60 up the Liffey, wreaking havoc in the Irish interior. The Irish learned, to their despair, that no monastery was safe. Yet interestingly, modern historians point out that the Vikings were not uniquely evil in targeting churches. You see, in Ireland, rival Irish warlords had already been raiding each other's monasteries for wealth, well before the Vikings even arrived. Monasteries functioned as wealthy repositories of goods, and sometimes as fortified refuges in local conflicts, so they of course became natural targets for raiders, whether they be Irish, Norse, or otherwise. There was a difference though, and the difference was that Vikings, as pagan outsiders, inspired a special kind of dread. Their attackers weren't constrained by Christian norms or local truces, and their motive appeared to contemporaries as sheer lust for destruction. Nonetheless, the pragmatic motive was treasure. It's always about the money. Monasteries held gold, silver, jeweled relics, fine fabrics, food stores, and, or perhaps most disturbingly, potential slaves. All, of course, highly prized commodities. In England, the Kingdom of Wessex under King Alfred, 871 to 899, was the only Anglo-Saxon realm to withstand the Viking tide at its height. Alfred fought numerous battles against the great heathen army, such as Ashdown in 871 and Eddington in 878, eventually forcing the Viking leader Guthrum to accept baptism and agree to a division of territory. Alfred's kingdom of Wessex thus survived, and over the next century his successors reconquered the Danelaw. However, it's not all good news. Viking raids on England didn't cease because of that. They just shifted in their scope. In the late 10th century, new Scandinavian forces, mostly Danes and Norwegians, began raiding England again. But this time, under leaders like King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. These renewed raids were larger strategic invasions, aimed at conquering, not just plundering, and indeed led to King Canute of Denmark seizing the crown of England in 1016, kind of a low point for the Anglo-Saxons, establishing, of course, a North Sea empire. Thus the arc in the British Isles went from supplies raids to major wars of conquest. Even the end of the Viking Age in 1066 is defined in England by battles against Viking descent invaders. That year saw the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada lead a Viking army in invasion of England. He was defeated at Stamford Bridge, however, and shortly after, Duke William of Normandy, himself of Viking descent, successfully conquered England at Hastings. By 1066, the lines between raider and ruler was quite blurry. Vikings had become kings, and their military expeditions had evolved into organized armies, resembling those of other feudal states. The Carolingian Empire and its successor kingdoms, West Francia, East Francia, etc., but they were also lucrative theatres for Viking raiders. Not only were there wealthy cities and monasteries, Paris, Rouen, Nantes, Bordeaux, Hamburg, etc., but the internal strife among the political factions of the Franks often left defences weak. Well, in 841, the Vikings sacked Rouen. In 843, as I noted, they took Nantes as well. In 845 came the dramatic sack of Paris by a fleet under the legendary chieftain, often identified Regnar or Ragnar. This pattern in Francia was that whenever the Frankish kings were preoccupied or divided, Viking incursions would multiply. They sailed up the Scheldt to attack what is now Belgium, up the Rhine into Germanic lands, and repeatedly up the Seine and Loire in France. The annals of St. Bertin recount a particularly adventurous foray in 844, where a Viking force sailed down the Atlantic coast and into the Iberian Peninsula. They, quote, ascended the Garonne as far as Toulouse. Some, after leaving this region, went into Galicia. Others went farther into Spain and engaged in long and desperate combats with the Saracens. Defeated in the end, they withdrew. Well, what does that tell us? Well, it reveals that the Vikings tested even the powerful emirate of Cordova. That was in Islamic Spain. In 844, a Viking fleet attacked Lisbon, which was then under Muslim rule, pillaged Cadiz, and sailed up the Guadalquivir to sack Seville, before the Muslim emir's forces ultimately expelled them. Arabic sources marveled at these Majus, Norse fire worshippers they called them, who appeared on strange ships. One source notes the use of cavalry and crossbowmen by the Andalusians to finally defeat them. And indeed, the Frankish annals confirm that in Galicia some Vikings fell to the arbalests, that is, crossbows, of the defending troops. One of the earliest references to crossbows being used in Spain, incidentally. But although these Iberian raids were not consistently repeated, the Vikings did not establish enclaves in Spain as they did in France or Britain. They do demonstrate the far reach of the Viking enterprise. Beyond the 844 attack, Vikings made other incursions into the Mediterranean world. In 1859-62, a large Viking fleet under the famous leaders Hastin and Bjorn Ironside allegedly sailed from West Francia to the Strait of Gibraltar, raiding as they went, of course. Now, if we trust the later saga embellishments from the saga of Ragnar's sons and other tales, Bjorn and Hastin harried the coast of Spain and southern France, then wintered in Morocco, raiding the Balearic Islands, and even sacked the city of Luna in Italy, which they had apparently mistook for Rome, according to legend. Quite lucky for the Romans, though. One colourful little detail from these later accounts describes how the Vikings gained entry to Luna by a ruse. Feigning that Hastin had died, they begged for a bishop for Christian burial. Once Hastin's coffin was carried into the town church, he leapt out, quite alive, and then, led his men in a surprise attack. While the saga literature must be treated with a little bit of caution, the core truth is that Vikings did reach the western Mediterranean. In 861, a Viking fleet attacked Pisa in Italy and fought a Moorish fleet off the coast. Some Vikings even pushed on into the eastern Mediterranean. But there are reports, though pretty rare ones, of Vikings serving as mercenaries in North Africa and the Levant. However, the eastern Mediterranean expeditions were limited, and more often than not they ended badly. Europe's southern waters were not as favorable to Viking longships, and strong Muslim and Byzantine navies eventually checked their ambition. In the east, Swedish Vikings, often termed Varangians or Rus, traced a very different but equally fascinating path. Rather than raiding Christian monasteries, these Norsemen penetrated the river networks of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, navigating routes from the the Baltic Sea rather, southward. Their motives here were largely trade and opportunistic warfare. They established trade towns like Novgorod and Staraya Lagoda, and by the mid-9th century, a group of Varangians known as the Rus had founded a polity around Kiev. These East Vikings traded furs, amber, and slaves for Byzantine silks and Islamic silver. But of course, they could also turn violent. The annals of St. Bertin record that in 839 a delegation of men calling themselves Rus appeared out of the court of Louis the Pious in Francia, claiming that they were envoys from the Byzantine Empire. Well, Louis was suspicious that they were in fact Swedes, disguised as diplomats. Now that marks the first appearance of Rus in Western records, and it suggests the Vikings by then had reached Constantinople. Indeed, the Byzantines themselves soon felt the force of the Rus. In 860, a fleet of Rus Vikings launched a surprise attack on Constantinople, catching the city undefended, while the imperial army was away on campaign. Byzantine patriarch Photius, an eyewitness, wrote that the city was nearly taken by this sudden onslaught. He said they were like a swarm of wasps, and only divine intervention was believed to have saved Constantinople on that day. Although that raid eventually dissipated, the Rus would return. Later, Princess Oleg and Igor of Kiev led expeditions against Constantinople in 907 and 941, extracting trade concessions via treaties. By the late 10th century, relations had returned to the point where the Varangians, or the Viking mercenaries, became the elite Varangian guard of the Byzantine emperors, feared for their axe-wielding prowess and unwavering loyalty. The Eastern Vikings did not stop at the Black Sea, however. Some traveled further south via the Caspian. In the 10th century, there were at least 2 major Viking expeditions into the Muslim world of Persia. Arab chroniclers like Ibn Miskawayh tell of a Rus fleet that sailed down the Volga, entered the Caspian, and raided the territories of modern Azerbaijan and Iran around 912 to 913, before being largely annihilated by a coalition of Muslim forces. Another enormous expedition around 1041, led by a Swede named Ingvar the Far-Travelled, sought wealth in the lands of the Circland, the Norse word for the Caliphate, roughly. This journey became legendary for its ambition, but also its tragic end. About 30 runestones in Sweden, the so-called Ingvar runestones, commemorate those who travelled to the east with Ingvar and never returned. The inscriptions on these stones paint a sobering picture. Many a family lost sons and fathers on that adventure, who met their fate in Circland, fighting battles far from home. It was the last great Viking roaming expedition of the Viking Age, and it shows that even as late as the 11th century, Scandinavians were still seeking plunder and glory across the known world. But when we really look at it, what drove the Viking expansion and all these ferocious raiding enterprises? Well, I must caution you against any single cause explanation. It's rather a mix: social, cultural, economic, and even environmental factors. First and foremost, economic gain. We can't pass that one up, can't we? It's clearly a major incentive. The Viking Age coincided with a growing market for silver and slaves in Europe and the Middle East. Vikings targeted monasteries and towns because, well, that was where all the portable wealth could be found. Gold and silver chalices, coin hoards, jewels, fine cloth, livestock, and of course human captives who could be sold in the slave markets from Dublin to Constantinople. Enslaved captives were a very lucrative commodity. The Vikings established slave markets in places like Dublin and Hedeby, and many unfortunate victims were sold onward to the Islamic world, which at the time had an extremely high demand for slaves. Indeed, Arab dirham coins found in hoards in Scandinavia point to a massive influx of silver from trading slaves and furs eastward. If you want to learn more about that, I did a full video about the Islamic slave trade. About a week ago, I think. Anyway, go and check that one out. Yet, profit alone, that doesn't explain the timing and ferocity of the raids. Political and demographic pressures at home have to also be considered. You see, Scandinavia in the late 8th century was undergoing internal changes. The consolidation of kingdoms. Well, Denmark, for instance, was coalescing under Godfred and later Harald Finehair in Norway. Ambitious chieftains who lost power struggles, or younger sons deprived of inheritance under the strict Scandinavian rules of succession, might have taken to raiding overseas as a way to carve out their own fortunes. It's an old-fashioned get-rich-quick scheme. Some scholars have suggested that a shortage of farmable land or a population boom in Scandinavia could have pushed surplus warriors abroad. However, evidence for a population boom, well, that's a little bit debatable. There was another theory, though: retaliation or opportunism. The pagan Norse army may have been reacting to external threats. For example, Charlemagne's forcible conversion and the massacre of the Saxons in the 780s. Well, that might have alarmed their pagan neighbors somewhat, stirring a desire for reprisal or preemptive wealth acquisition. Though, once again, there's a bit of speculation around that. But it's speculation that we should engage in. Cultural and religious elements, they also had their role to play. In Norse culture, going a Viking, to go raid overseas, had a kind of social prestige behind it. Young Scandinavian warriors sought to win fame and glory, which in their honor-based society was just as valuable, if not more valuable, than any gold they could carry back. The sagas, though written later, depict raiding as an almost rite of passage for adventurous men, a way to gain reputation, the praise of skaldic poets, and even nicknames commemorating deeds. Status in Norse society could be earned by successful warfare abroad, which brought not only riches, but renown. Recent scholarship emphasizes this aspect too. Exotic loot was prized not merely for its monetary value, but as a kind of status symbol. And one archaeologist in our modern time, Stephen Ashby, has noted that Viking warriors often kept unique treasures intact rather than melting them down, using them to signal their exploits. Kind of like a souvenir, I suppose. Items like silks, jeweled reliquaries, or strange ornaments from far-off lands, they would have been displayed back home, conferring on their owner a kind of magical prestige for having been to the unknown world and returned with full pockets. Possessing a relic from a distant monastery, or an ornate Frankish sword, it marked a man as a veteran of foreign campaigns, and of course it elevated his standing. In short, honor and heroism were key motivators. The Vikings were not solely profit-driven pirates, but rather competitors in a heroic economy of reputation. As Ashby observes, the very act of participating in a successful raid could win a man accolades for courage and cunning, might even earn him a bit of a nickname, and everyone's proud of that. And just imagine you being the Viking, having a few buddies around, and saying, "Oh, that thing, that jeweled cross? Yes, I looted that from an English monastery about 10 years ago." It's not bad, isn't it? Yeah. We also have religion and ideology. Though often overstated in popular imaginations, they did factor in subtly. You see, the Vikings, they were pagan at the outset. We all know they worshipped gods like Odin and Thor, that kind of thing. Dying sword in hand was, according to their belief, a pathway to Odin's great hall. This warrior ethos may have made them more fearless or even reckless in combat, unafraid of death, keen to display their berserk ferocity. But on the flip side, their paganism and the targets they chose led Christian monks to frame the Vikings as instruments of God's wrath. Alcuin admonished the sack of Lindisfarne, saying it was not accidental, but rather, indeed, a sign from God for the sins of the people. Many clergy in Europe thought the impious Northmen were a scourge sent to chastise a Christendom that had gone off the rails. The Vikings themselves probably didn't see it in such terms. It just wasn't that deep. To them, churches were just fair targets, a big pile of money to be taken. They didn't think of them as a spiritual thing. Still, later on, when some Vikings converted to Christianity, we can think of Guthrum or the early 10th century Norse in Normandy, religious motivations could shift. Christian Danes in the 11th century, like King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway or King Canute of Denmark, still led raids or wars abroad, but they justified them in these new ways, as legitimate wars, or even as crusading endeavors, rather than just mere plunder. But by and large, I don't think many people are arguing that the Viking raiders were driven by pragmatic considerations of gain and personal advancement, framed within this cultural ethos, a rather thin frame, I suppose, but it did celebrate adventure and martial achievement quite a lot. So it does have to be discussed. So how do we sum it all up? It's a bit difficult, isn't it? Well, I tell you what, I think we can all agree that the Viking raids were not just wanton bursts of random violence, but they were a lot more complex than that. Militarily, they introduced new tactics in naval mobility and siegecraft, and politically, they forced kingdoms to reform or perish, and even spawned together new polities led by Norse elites. Economically, they knitted far-flung regions together through trade and tribute. One might even argue they were agents of an early form of globalization, connecting Baghdad to York via trade routes. Culturally, they left behind a richer, more hybrid society in many regions, one that blended Norse and Christian practices. And at the human level, they left behind stories of terror, yes, but also of adventure and exploration. By the close of the Viking Age around 1066, all those raids faded away as Scandinavia's kingdoms themselves became Christianized and integrated into European polities. Kings like Olaf of Norway and Sweyn of Denmark had far less incentive to permit freebooting when they could build centralized kingdoms and just tax people. Many former Vikings became royal housecarls or turned to mercenary work abroad. Europe, having learned hard lessons, also improved its own defenses. There were, by the 11th century, a lot less easy targets left. But for all that, the saga of how Viking raids were conducted, with daring ruthlessness from Lindisfarne's devastating sack, all the way to the high walls of Paris and the distant banks of the Volga, it's still quite captivating. At least, I think so. I assume you do. You're still here an hour later. It's still a chapter of history replete with the clash of cultures, though. Tactical ingenuity and larger-than-life characters steering their dragon-headed longboats to the edges of the known world. So, I think that's all we have for today. And as we close it up, you can't help but imagine the terrifying sight back then, but romanticized sight now, of Viking longships cutting across a sea at dawn. It's a vision that held a doom for some, fame for others. But ultimately, just another sign of the changing tides. A new era in the medieval world. And that's where we ended. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you had fun. I did, of course. I would like to thank my top-tier patron and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfadnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, and Mary. And that's it. Thank you so much. I will see you next time. Lots of love to you all, as always, and farewell for now.